You're 6 months into the CEO role. Your board brought you in as CEO because growth has stalled at 18 million. In fact, it's been flat for 3 years. You've diagnosed the problems. The sales team won't surface pipeline risks until the deals are lost. Product won't challenge engineering's technical assumptions. The executive team nods in agreement during meetings, then fragments into silos between them. The symptoms are all different, but the root cause is the same. Your organisation can't execute because people will not speak up. And it's not because they don't care. It's because speaking up feels dangerous. This is the hidden friction that kills growth. When your team self-censors, you lose early warning signals. Problems surface late. Cross-functional coordination breaks down and innovation stalls. The very capabilities you need to restart growth, candour, coordination and rapid iteration, are all blocked by interpersonal risk. Today's briefing explores the research on psychological safety, what it actually is, and why it directly impacts your team's ability to execute. How to build it without sacrificing performance standards. We'll hear from 3 researcher experts who have spent decades studying these dynamics. First, Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School, who pioneered the study of psychological safety in teams and recently published research showing it's a resource that protects organisations during constraint and uncertainty, exactly the conditions that you're facing. Second, Timothy Clark, who has created a 4-stage framework that helps leaders diagnose where their teams are struggling and what specific behaviours will help them move forward. And third, Brené Brown, whose research on vulnerability and courage reveals why leaders must model the very behaviour they need to see, and what gets in the way. A quick note on format. What you're hearing is the synthesis of these experts' published research and frameworks. We have worked to represent their ideas accurately whilst translating them to your specific context. That is, a CEO trying to build the organisational capabilities that will enable growth. Let's start with Amy Edmondson's foundational research on what psychological safety actually is and why it matters for performance. Here's a synthesis of Edmondson's perspective. Edmondson's research over the past 2 decades reveals a counterintuitive finding. The highest performing teams don't make fewer mistakes, they report more of them. In her early work studying hospital nursing teams, Edmondson discovered that the best teams were surfacing and discussing medication errors openly, while lower performing teams kept those errors hidden. The difference wasn't competence or care, it was psychological safety. Psychological safety, according to Edmondson, is a shared belief among team members that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. It's the confidence that you won't be punished, humiliated, or rejected for speaking up with questions, concerns, mistakes, or new ideas. This is distinct from trust, which is about whether you'll do what you say. Psychological safety is about whether it's safe to be honest, about what you don't know, what's going wrong, or what could be done better. Edmondson's 2024 research with Michaela Carisi, published in the International Journal of Public Health, demonstrates that psychological safety functions as a social resource, particularly critical during times of constraint. Studying healthcare workers throughout the pandemic, they found that a 1 standard deviation increase in psychological safety resulted in measurably lower burnout and significantly higher retention, even when people lacked adequate tools or staffing. The protective effect was strongest for physicians, women, and people of colour, groups historically less likely to speak up or be listened to. This matters for growth mandate CEOs because constraint is your reality. You don't have an unlimited runway. You are working with the team you inherited, not the team that you'd build from scratch. Resources are tight. In this environment, psychological safety becomes even more valuable because it allows you to extract maximum learning and coordination from the people and budget that you have. Edmondson emphasises 6 common misconceptions that cause leaders to implement psychological safety incorrectly. First, it's not about being nice to avoid argument. Productive disagreement and constructive feedback are essential. Second, it's not a personality trait, it is a feature of the team environment that leaders create. Third, it's not the opposite of high performance. Teams with high psychological safety have high standards and get better results. Fourth, it can't be mandated by policy, it is built through repeated interaction. Fifth, It doesn't require consensus or complete agreement. It requires that all voices are heard before decisions are made. And sixth, it doesn't start at the top. Any leader at any level can build it within their team. The link to execution is direct. When people feel safe speaking up, problems surface earlier, when they're smaller and cheaper to fix. Cross-functional handoffs improve because teams can be honest about dependencies and constraints. Innovation accelerates because people test ideas rapidly rather than perfecting them in isolation. Decision quality improves because diverse perspectives are actually voiced, not just present in the room. Edmondson's recent work identifies 3 leadership behaviours that create psychological safety. First, frame the work clearly. Emphasise uncertainty, complexity, and interdependence. Make it clear why everyone's voice matters and that you're working on problems where no one has all of the answers. Second, invite input genuinely. Ask good questions, acknowledge your own gaps, and create structures where speaking up is normal, not heroic. Third, respond productively. Thank people for speaking up, even when the news is bad. Separate the messenger from the message and sanction those who shoot the messenger. A critical insight from Edmondson's work, psychological safety enables learning behaviour, and learning behaviour drives organisational performance. Individual learning doesn't automatically translate to organisational learning. Organisations improve when processes change, innovations are implemented, and new approaches are scaled. This requires people to share what they're learning, surface problems, ask for help, and experiment, all behaviours that require psychological safety. For CEOs facing stalled or low growth, this creates a clear link. Restarting growth requires organisational learning at speed. You need rapid iteration on go-to-market approaches, faster problem solving across functions, and the ability to pivot when strategies are not working. None of this happens if your team is self-censoring because interpersonal risk feels too high. Edmondson's 2025 work at Unleash emphasised that high psychological safety means high learning quotient. Teams that learn quickly have clear goals, necessary expertise, adequate resource and sufficient effort, and the candour to speak up about what they see and know. Without that last piece, the other capabilities don't translate to performance. The CEO's job is to make speaking up less risky than staying silent. For a CEO trying to restart growth, this means psychological safety is not a cultural nice-to-have. It is operational infrastructure. You need fast feedback loops. You need cross-functional coordination. You need rapid iteration. All of these require people to be honest about reality, which requires safety. But Edmondson's framework operates at the team level. How does this scale across an organisation with multiple teams and layers? Timothy Clark's research offers a diagnostic framework that helps leaders understand where teams are in their psychological safety journey and which specific behaviours will help move them forward. Clark's framework recognises that psychological safety develops progressively, following the natural pattern of human needs in social settings. His 4-stage model, inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety, provides leaders with a diagnostic tool. Where is your team stuck? What behaviour will move you to the next stage? The framework is built on 2 dimensions, respect and permission. Respect is the acknowledgement that people deserve to be included based on their humanity. Permission is the leader's active invitation for people to participate, learn, contribute, and challenge. Both are necessary, and the stages reflect increasing levels of each. Stage 1, inclusion safety, the foundation where people feel they belong to the team. Clark emphasises that this begins with an unconditional offer of respect for all human beings. Inclusion safety satisfied the basic need to connect and belong. Without it, people disengage, hold back, and eventually leave. Leaders create inclusion safety by making it clear that everyone is welcomed, valued, and has a place on the team. This seems basic, but Clark's work with organisations reveals how often this fails. People are physically present, but psychologically excluded. For growth mandate CEOs, this has immediate implication. If you've inherited a team with tenure and history, there may be subtle hierarchies, original employees versus the newer hires, technical experts versus business generalists, headquarters versus regional offices. These create inclusion faults where people self-censor. Growth requires the full team contributing, not just that inner circle. Stage 2, learner safety, where people feel safe to engage in the learning process by asking questions, giving and receiving feedback, experimenting and making mistakes. Clark argues that you can't demand learning, you inspire it by creating a supportive environment. Learner safety acknowledges that people are works in progress and that mistakes are part of development, not evidence of incompetence. This stage is critical for execution velocity. When people fear looking incompetent, they avoid asking clarifying questions. They don't surface their confusion about priorities. They don't admit when they don't know how to do something. And the result is slower execution because people are figuring things out in isolation rather than learning collectively. Clark observes that learner safety is rarely present without inclusion safety. If you don't feel you belong, you won't risk looking ignorant. But the reverse is not automatic. Some teams have strong inclusion but punish mistakes, creating a comfortable but stagnant environment where people will not try new approaches. Stage 3, contributor safety, where people feel safe to use their skills and make meaningful contribution. At this stage, individuals have both the confidence and permission to do the work, share ideas, and add value in their areas of expertise. Contributor safety satisfied the need to make a difference and see your contributions matter. For CEOs, this is where execution happens. If people have ideas for improving processes, accelerating deals, or removing bottlenecks, but don't voice them because they fear rejection or dismissal, you're losing significant capacity. Contributor safety isn't just about people feeling good, it's about extracting the insight and improvements they're seeing but not sharing. Clark notes that organisations often struggle here because they confuse activity with contribution. People are busy, working hard, but not feeling safe to offer real input on how work could be done better. The CEO signal, whether they genuinely want input or just compliance, will determine whether contributor safety develops. Stage 4, challenger safety, where people feel safe to question the status quo, challenge assumptions, and suggest the organisation or team change direction. Clark describes this as democratising innovation, making it safe for anyone to challenge, not just the senior people. Challenger safety gives people permission to be candid, even blunt if they have good intentions and want to improve outcome. This is the most psychologically risky stage and the most valuable for growth. If your strategy isn't working, you need people close to customers, markets, and operations to challenge. If your processes are creating bottlenecks, you need people living in those processes to surface it. If your executive team is misaligned, you need someone to name it. Clark's research shows that challenger safety is rare in organisations. The result is that people with the most current information, frontline employees, new team members, or specialists in specific domains will self-censor when they see problems. Leadership will get filtered feedback, making decisions on incomplete information. So, for a CEO brought in to restart growth, this is particularly dangerous. Your predecessor's strategies stopped working. The organisation needs to change. If only you and your executive team are allowed to challenge the status quo, you're relying on a handful of perspectives. If everyone can challenge constructively, you access the collective intelligence of the organisation. Clark emphasises that these stages are cumulative, that you can't skip ahead. An organisation with weak inclusion safety won't develop genuine challenger safety, even if the CEO invites challenge. People will not take the risk because the foundation is not there. The framework is diagnostic. Where are you weakest? That's where to invest leadership attention and behaviour change. The practical implication for CEOs is that building psychological safety isn't about making one inspiring speech. It's about moving through these stages systematically, demonstrated through repeated interactions that each type of risk-taking is genuinely safe. Clark's framework gives you the language to assess where your team is and what specific behaviours, from you and your leaders, will create the next level of safety. Clark's 4-stage framework gives you your diagnostic lens. If your team won't challenge your strategy, the problem might not be at stage 4, it might be back at stage 1 or 2. People who don't feel included will not challenge. People who fear looking ignorant will not contribute. So this suggests a sequencing strategy. Start with the foundation. Make sure people feel that they genuinely belong. Create a culture of learner safety by responding well when people admit confusion or mistake. Build contributor safety by implementing the team's ideas. Only then can you create challenger safety where people feel safe to tell you what is not working. But there's a personal dimension here that both Edmondson and Clark touch on, but don't emphasise. The leader's own vulnerability. This is where Brené Brown's research becomes essential. To create psychological safety, you have to model the behaviour you want, speaking out about uncertainty, admitting mistakes, and being honest about what you don't know. Brown's work explores why this is so difficult for leaders and what it requires. Brown's 2 decades of research on vulnerability, courage, shame, and empathy reveal a central tension. The behaviours that create trust and connection, being honest about uncertainty, admitting mistakes, and asking for help, feel risky because they expose us to potential judgment. Leaders face this acutely because they are expected to have all the answers, project confidence, and appear in control. Yet, those very behaviours that will create psychological safety require stepping out of that armour. Brown defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's not weakness or oversharing. It's the willingness to show up when you cannot control the outcome. Her research, particularly her 2018 book Dare to Lead, and her 2025 work on daring leadership, emphasises that courage and vulnerability are inseparable. You cannot get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. For CEOs brought in to restart stalled growth, this creates a very specific dilemma. You are hired to appear confident and capable. Your board expects you to have a plan. Your team is looking for decisive leadership. Yet, creating that psychological safety that enables execution velocity requires you to be honest about uncertainty, to say, I don't know, I need your input. We're going to try this and learn, and I made a mistake. Brown's research identifies the armour leaders use to avoid vulnerability: perfectionism, numbing, being the knower instead of the learner, using cynicism to avoid disappointment, and leading from hurt and fear rather than values. This armour feels protective, but actually prevents the connection and trust that's necessary for high-performing teams. When leaders armour up, their teams follow suit. The alternative Brown proposes is daring leadership, being willing to have difficult conversations, making values-based decisions even when uncomfortable, giving and receiving honest feedback, and practicing self-awareness and self-compassion. This isn't about being soft, it's about being brave enough to be honest. Brown's research with organisations globally reveals 4 skill sets of daring leadership, and all of them require psychological safety, both to practice and to create. The first is rumbling with vulnerability, recognising when you're in the arena with uncertainty and risk, and choosing to engage rather than armour up. The second is living into values, clarifying what matters most and practicing those values through observable behaviours, especially when it's hard. The third is braving trust, using the elements of trust, boundaries, reliability, accountability, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity to build and repair trust with teams. The fourth is learning to rise, how you respond when you fail, fall, or get things wrong. Each of these skill sets models the behaviours that create psychological safety. When leaders rumble with vulnerability, they demonstrate that it's safe to be uncertain. When they live by values despite discomfort, they show that difficult conversations are expected. When they build trust through reliability and accountability, they lay the foundation for risk-taking to feel safe. When they rise from failures with learning rather than blame, they signal that mistakes are part of the growth process. Brown's 2025 book, Strong Ground, addresses leadership in times of deep uncertainty, the exact context growth mandates CEOs face. She argues that when bluster and hubris are increasingly framed as acceptable forms of leadership, we need to reclaim courageous leadership grounded in connection, discipline, and accountability. This means having the courage to say, I don't know what will work, but here is what we're going to try and learn. A critical insight from Brown's work: leaders significantly underestimate the courage required to create psychological safety. Inviting people to challenge your thinking feels threatening. Admitting you made a hiring mistake feels like failure. Asking your board for patience while you figure out what is broken feels risky. But yet these are precisely the behaviours that will create the safety where others can be honest with you. Brown's research on shame and empathy also illuminates why psychological safety is hard to sustain. When leaders experience shame, not about knowing, about mistakes, about the organisation's struggles, the instinct is to protect the ego by shutting down feedback, blaming others, or projecting invulnerability. This destroys psychological safety instantly. The alternative is shame resilience, recognising shame when it shows up, reaching out rather than pulling back, and speaking about it rather than letting it drive behaviour. For growth mandate CEOs, Brown work suggests that building psychological safety starts with your own willingness to be vulnerable. You can't ask your team to surface risk, admit mistakes, and challenge assumptions if you're not modelling those behaviours. This doesn't mean inappropriate sharing or leadership that appears weak. It means being honest when you're uncertain, asking for input when you need it, acknowledging mistake, and thanking people for difficult feedback. Brown emphasises that vulnerability is not optional for leadership impact. Her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, with over 60 million views, resonates because people recognise this truth. Leaders they remember, trust, and follow are the ones who were brave enough to be real. In her work with CEOs globally, through the Centre for Daring Leadership at Better Up, she's seen that the organisations that outperform during uncertainty are led by people willing to say, we are navigating this together, rather than, I have all the answers. This practical challenge Brown identifies is that vulnerability feels dangerous precisely when it's risky. There's no guarantee of how people will respond, but the research is clear. When leaders take the first risk by being vulnerable, it creates permission for others to do the same. And over time, this builds the psychological safety where honest, difficult, and constructive conversations become the norm rather than the exception. 3 researchers, 3 frameworks, and 1 convergent insight. Psychological safety is infrastructure for execution, not cultural luxury. Edmondson shows us it's a measurable team condition that enables learning and performance, particularly under constraint. Clark gives us a diagnostic framework to assess where those teams are stuck and what behaviours will help move them forward. Brown reveals that leaders must model vulnerability to create the safety that they want to see. Where these perspectives converge is critical for you as a CEO. You can't delegate the creation of psychological safety. Your team is watching how you respond when someone admits that they don't know, or when a project fails, and when someone challenges your thinking. Each response either builds or erodes safety. The pattern you create in your executive team cascades across the organisation. Here's what you can do. First, assess where your executive team is using Clark's framework. Do people feel included and valued? Are they comfortable admitting what they don't know? Do they contribute ideas freely? Do they challenge each other's thinking and yours? Be honest about which stage you're stuck at. Second, examine your own responses to vulnerability using Brown's lens. When someone admits a mistake, do you thank them or do you focus on the failure? When someone says, I don't know, do you create a learning space or signal that they should have known? Your reflexive responses are programming your culture. Third, test Edmondson's 3 behaviours this week. Frame the work by acknowledging what you're uncertain about. Invite input by asking genuine questions that you don't have the answers. And respond to difficult news by thanking the messenger before addressing the message. Fourth, look at one critical cross-functional process where execution is stalling. Use psychological safety as the diagnostic. What's not being said? What risks are people seeing but not surfacing? What process improvements are obvious to people in the work but are not voiced? The gap between what people know and what they're saying is the psychological safety gap. And finally, recognise that psychological safety and high standards go together, not in opposition. The goal is not comfortable consensus. It is honest, constructive disagreement that surfaces problems early and accelerates solutions. As Edmondson emphasises, the highest performing teams have the hardest conversations because they've made those conversations safe to have. The question for you, in 6 months, do you want an organisation that tells you what you want to hear, or one that tells you what you need to know? The answer determines whether you build psychological safety or keep wondering why execution is slower than it should be.